many people immediately sort of think about formal lobbying or sort of campaign contributions as the primary vehicle for the military industrial complex to sort of influence foreign policy. But really, this is just like the tip of the iceberg, right? So you can observe lobbying. You can see that there are sort of regulatory and reporting requirements and structures in place. And this gives us sort of a false sense of security that the system is somehow sort of transparent and manageable. But really, that's just the legalized and formal activity that I think sort of serves to obfuscate like the real channels of influence that exist and do help militarize our foreign policy. The first, as Bill already mentioned, is think tank funding, right? So ensuring that the think tanks and the research and policy organizations that get funded with a lot of money for new initiatives and to hire new researchers and to amplify their content, that those organizations have a line that is consistent in its support for militarism, right? Which by definition requires the production of vast amounts of weaponry, right? And that they can produce the sort of expert research and testimony that gets actually into the offices of policymakers and then eventually gets sort of adopted by those policymakers. Sometimes that process is sort of quite literal in the sense that you can read hawkish reports and research findings from a lot of think tanks, and then see them physically get sort of packaged into press releases and then distributed systematically to major media outlets and wind up in slightly modified form in major newspapers and then copied and pasted almost into legislative remarks and congressional policy papers. So it's very interesting when you're really looking at a lot of this stuff, you can see the same sort of phraseology and the same wording just making its way from point A to point B to point C, and then sort of manifesting itself in our foreign policy. Another element is the industry associations and the sort of technical groups that Bill also alluded to, right? That act as sort of expert advisory bodies for U.S. agencies. Which includes actually a large range of sort of formal industry exchange programs, right, that take defense industry personnel and then place them in sort of mid-career rotations, right, in U.S. government agencies. The vast majority of those programs being reserved for the military-related agencies, right? The same people are literally just continuously sort of brought into both administrations. Republican and Democratic administrations over and over again, because they are the people that are reliable voices in favor of extremely hawkish and aggressive foreign policies that have to be supplied by the military industrial complex. Universities are also sort of really going after scarce funding for scientific research and for fellowships and just all kinds of sort of support, which is also exploited by the military industrial complex. So just this week, I got an email from this gentleman in my capacity as the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, which provides support also for the MA and the BA programs in Middle East Studies. And he emailed me because he wanted to set up a fund in his own name that would finance scholarships for students at GW who wanted to work on commercial diplomacy between the US and the Middle East. So anytime I hear the phrase commercial diplomacy, I think immediately of the arms trade, right? And sure enough, I looked the guy up and he worked for Northrop Grumman for 23 years as an offset program manager, right? So these individuals literally have, so much money at their disposal to create these vast sort of structures and networks of support and funding and financing that reach into every sector of the US economy and even into nonprofits to support individuals that are going to act in the interests of defense firms, right? And the students that would have gone through that program probably would have gone to dinners with gone to dinners that were arranged with executives because they were the financiers of the fellowships and had probably special programming designed for them during the summer about commercial diplomacy, and a lot of the panels would just happen to be delivered by defense industry executives and professionals. So and that gets multiplied just by the tens of thousands sort of every day in universities across the US. And the last thing that I want to mention is this concept that underlies so much of the strategic research that actually gets done at think tanks, which is that they argue in support of military sales and loose export regimes in the pursuit of leverage, right? Leverage over our allies and other countries, right? So the argument is that weapons exports are a strategic policy that allows the US to influence outcomes without deploying troops. But this is such an absurd sort of farce. And the fact that it's reproduced just without contest is really incredible. So, I mean, the United States has troops in 150 countries, maybe up to 70,000 in the Middle East, and about 800, overseas military installations, right? So weapon sales are not replacing boots on the ground, right? And then you also have the smuggling and the proliferation of US weapons in conflict zones, right? Where they end up being a force equalizer in the enemy's favor, right? Which suggests that weapons exports are a basic tactical error, right? That somehow just gets repeated ad nauseum, and that none of these think tanks which are doing this research sort of ever, deign to point out. I can't really think of a case where a US recipient of a major weapons contract or exports or military aid actually ever acquiesced to any serious pressure from the US on any issue of significance, right? I mean, if you think about the two most important sort of regional, or three most important regional recipients of weapons and military assistance in the Middle East, right? Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia, presumably the most dependent, right, on US weapons and exports. And they have flagrantly violated the most basic desires of the US foreign policy establishment over and over again, right? So if arms exports have ever achieved meaningful leverage, then I'd be very happy to have someone point out those cases to me, but I don't see any of them. The fundamental measure of democratic rule is whether the preferences of the electorate actually get translated into policy, and whether those preferences are about military spending or the provision of healthcare or income tax policy. There are empirical studies that have shown that the will of the public bears like almost no resemblance to the actual federal legislation that ends up getting passed by Congress, right? There's no sort of correlation between public opinion surveys about these issues and the actual policy outcomes, right? So one of the things that we really need to work on is to make sure that sort of money and influence peddling are not like the sole inputs into the policymaking process, and that there is some sort of avenue for democracy to actually be translated into US foreign policy. And the other, which is also is similarly, I guess, pie in the sky, is nationalizing the defense industry, right? Just removing the profit motive as a potential driver of US foreign policy decisions. That relationship between war and profit is absolutely an input into the foreign policy process. It's undeniable, right? So, for example, I mean, think about in the 24-hour period after the US assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, right? The stock holdings of just 5 individuals, weapons industry executives, increased by $7 million. That's just 5 people in the space of 24 hours, right? So if you multiply that figure by the tens of thousands of executives and shareholders that are spread throughout the industry, and then the secondary industries that rely on that, right? Like industry trade publications, military industrial, specialized sort of investment managers and corporate analysts, the people who organize and ship and secure the weapons, the people who set up the arms fairs and the industry showcases. That adds up to an enormous industry of white collar professionals who are committed to this militant US posture because it is the basis of their entire professional and personal livelihoods. You can hardly blame them given how much US industry has been hollowed out in previous decades, but it creates this huge constituency of pro-war professionals. And the only way to really sever that chain is to remove that profit motive from the foreign policy formula. And really the only way that I can see to do that would be to turn the industry into one that's publicly owned.